Food, drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick.
Do you want to just start off by telling everyone who you are and what you study?
Yeah, so as you just said, my name is Manvir Singh. I am a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis. My research is about cultural traditions that reliably emerge. Why is it that human societies everywhere very reliably, very regularly develop complex cultural traditions with strikingly similarities? So why do we have religion? Why do we have music? Why do we have art? And not only why do we have these broad categories, but why do we also, in particular, have beliefs in supernatural agents, shamanism, beliefs in witchcraft, dance songs, lullabies? It's kind of the original project of anthropology. Why does human culture look the way it does? And in particular, why do we have these cultural universals? And so I use a combination of cognitive science, evolutionary theory, cultural evolutionary theory, ethnographic fieldwork, comparison of large-scale databases.
Yeah, so I think like a thread that we'll probably come back to quite a bit here is, despite all of the cultural diversity that's out there, the details often differ radically from one culture to the next, but there are similarities in terms of patterns, both at large scale and at a finer grain scale. And you can draw an analogy between culture and biology, right? I might study a particular bird or a particular beetle, but there are general principles that define how all creatures change and why they have certain core features in common or that serve similar functions, even though the specifics of that particular organism's makeup is different from another one's.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, that's sometimes how I think about my work, as a kind of taxonomic project where you are laying out the diversity of human culture, but recognizing these homologous or analogous structures within it or among traditions.
Yeah. And of course, the analogy runs pretty deep because cultures evolve just like organisms do. And we do inherit, one generation's culture is inherited from the last one. And there are things akin to mutations and all of the things that drive biological evolution. But of course, it's a different kind of evolution, right? It's cultural, and we can talk about what that means. It's happening at a different sort of speed and with a different pattern. But there is, I think, a deep analogy there.
For sure. And I think of cultural evolution as an important force, as an important process by which these patterns emerge. So part of the reason that human societies develop such strikingly similar culture, I have argued, is because of the way that cultural evolution is similar in diverse contexts, which is something we can go into.
Yeah. And of course, culture, we're talking about things that emerge at the level of human behavior and the human mind. And so I imagine that a lot of the similarities in patterns in terms of how things show up in human culture have deep roots in terms of the biology, ultimately, of the human mind itself.
Yeah, definitely. Wait, Nick, sorry, I got distracted because my email client is open, so I just wanted to close that.
Oh yeah, go for it. And while we'll sort of have this concept of cultural evolution in general in the back of our minds, but really the focus today is we're going to talk about one core aspect of human culture, which is religion/shamanism, and we'll sort of maybe have you define and talk about what the similarities and differences are there, because you've got a new book on the subject, you've done a lot of research on the subject. Before we get into that per se, is religion and spirituality, however you would define that, is that a cultural universal? Is that something you pretty much see in all human cultures in some form?
For sure. I mean, it depends on how you want to define it. But I think by many definitions of religion, you find it in societies everywhere. And I think probably at its foundation, religion often involves two things. It involves beliefs in supernatural agents and techniques or rituals or practices to engage with them, often for um, some kind of blessing or some kind of benefit. And so those two features you find ubiquitously. I think it's very, very hard to find a society without those.
In the intro of the book, you say, I'm just going to read a short sentence here. Say, religion and shamanism too emerges from a dance between tendencies. Our desperation to manage fortune and misfortune, combined with our belief in unseen forces, means that we preferentially turn to the beyond for blessings and salvation. So we've got this problem of fortune and misfortune in life. We've got an inherent potentially belief in unseen forces of some kind, and these two things are interacting. And so with that in mind, what does that mean? What are religion and shamanism? Are they two distinct things? Is one sort of the antecedent of the other, or are they aspects of the same underlying thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think people before me or various scholars, there was a tendency historically to treat shamanism as maybe magic and religion as something else. Um, but I think it's very hard to justify a distinction like that. I would say that shamanism is a form of religion. So, like you said, reading back my words, and like I was just saying, we can think about religion as beliefs in unseen agents or unseen forces and practices to deal with them, practices to engage with them, often for the control of fortune and misfortune. Shamanism is one manifestation of that. Shamanism is there's a specialist, they enter non ordinary states, and through those non ordinary states, they engage with these unseen agents, these unseen forces, and use that engagement to help you control uncertain outcomes. You're sick, you suspect that it's caused by witches or a crocodile spirit. The shaman in their rituals will enter a non-ordinary state, engage with witches, maybe fight them, see them, whatever the form of that engagement is manifold. It can take many forms. But through that engagement, then they assure you that the illness has gone away.
So, fortune and misfortune are just a natural part of life. Things happen that are good, that are bad, that are total calamities or total blessings. And obviously, naturally, people are concerned with those things and how they might play out or why they played out the way that they did. So basically, we have this natural tendency to believe in unseen forces of some kind. And so is it fair to say that a shaman is a specialist within a society who engages with these unseen forces, whatever they may be, through some methods, whatever they may be? And the point is to help people deal with or predict or come to terms with the turns of fortune that come with life.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you just said, but I would add the point that the an important feature of the techniques they use is non-ordinary states, or the apparently entering non-ordinary states. So yes, they're engaging with these unseen agents. They're helping control misfortune and misfortune, but a critical part of their technique is entering non-ordinary states, altered states of consciousness.
So there's an intention. They do it on purpose. They enter non-ordinary states through various means, and this comes up in different ways in different cultures. But that's a key intentional part of what shamanism would include.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, a lot of, some people maybe have barely heard of this term before. I've had people like Michael Winkelmann on in the past, and this is an area I'm very interested in. I've always been interested in religion and its evolution. But a lot of people who start to think about the subject will often think of shamanism as sort of an archaic form of religion, and then other different or better, or at least more elaborate or whatever, more modern religions evolved from it. So shamanism is a thing that came before, and then other things have come after that that are sort of the next step in evolution, so to speak. And so there, a lot of people would naturally draw distinctions between modern monotheistic religions, say like Christianity, and shamanism, that, these things are distinct to some real extent. But one thing that was interesting is in the introduction of your book on shamanism, you actually have a passage from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And that passage is that there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was already here long ago. It was here before our time. So what does that have to do with what I was just asking about? And why do you have a verse from the Bible in the beginning of a book about shamanism?
Yeah. So what you just described, this idea that shamanism is this archaic precursor to modern religions, to world religions, is something that I call the Pokemon theory of shamanism. This idea that shamanism, like a Pokemon, evolves from a religion, like a Pokemon, evolves from this simpler, primitive form to something more complex. Um, you find this endorsed in lots of prominent writings. A great example is Robert Wright's The Evolution of God, where he even says very explicitly something like shamans are these religious specialists in archaic societies, and they evolved into ayatollahs and archbishops. And so the purpose of that quote is really what the thesis of the book is, which is that shamanism is not something confined to far off, archaic, small scale societies, but instead is a facet of human culture that reliably develops ubiquitously. It was probably the nature of the earliest religion, but it manifests constantly and in the world around us. And so, if we think about the history of Christianity, for example, I think one story could be that Christianity maybe superseded shamanism. But as I argue in the book, I think a much more intellectually honest way of understanding the relationship of Christianity and shamanism is that instead within Christianity, there has constantly been a tension between a centralizing force that is anti-charisma, anti-trance, anti-prophecy, anti-divination, and another force, a very shamanic force, that is in favor of these, that is pushing for this more experientially vivid engagement with the supernatural. And a lot of Christianity is you have a splinter group that is very shamanic, and then that splinter group starts to institutionalize, starts to centralize, and it destroys those shamanic elements. And then you have it again, and you have it again. So instead of thinking about one evolving into the other, I think a better way of thinking about it is that there is often this cyclical competition between shamanism and authority, between charisma and centralization.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things that are coming up when you put it that way is the concept of mysticism. So shamanism or shamanistic manifestations of a religion would be, if I'm right here, it would be the practicing of a religious tradition in a way that is more mystical, that is embracing these non-ordinary states and things like that. And the other thing that comes up is that it's probably more decentralized in a way. So you're describing a competition between two different social forces, two different ways of organizing people, such that one of them will want this more decentralized mysticism, non-ordinary state way of doing their spiritual stuff, and the other side wants to centralize authority and minimize the role of that mystical experiential side. And these are just sort of two flavors or styles that any religious can be expressed in, maybe.
For sure, for sure. And the thing about a more shamanic manifestation of religion is that it is, for the most part, competitive with authority. So we can think about early Mormonism. Mormonism starts, and the early Mormon church is very filled with altered states, trance, speaking in tongues, healing. But then there is a turn against it. So an interesting example is Brigham Young. Brigham Young started out very into these trance states. He felt like it was an echo of the earliest church, but then later in his life, he thinks the Mormon church should not condone it, should not permit it. And the reason is that once you have other people who can experience the supernatural, who can prophesy, who can channel God or whatever kind of supernatural agent you have, then that is competition. That is an alternative source of doctrine, of creed. It's an alternative religious authority. And so by delegitimizing trance, by saying that other individuals cannot enter trance and cannot have this particular relationship with the divine, you centralize authority in a figure like the Mormon prophet or a cardinal or a bishop.
So
you
even if I think
these
about
charismatic upstarts.
Yeah. So even if we think about one world religion, so Christianity will be familiar to many people. It's got there's many different types of Christianity, many different branches in that clade of the religious evolutionary tree. And something like, say, that, when you think of, say, the Pentecostals, they speak in tongues and dance around with snakes and go into altered states on purpose. That would be a more shamanic expression of Christianity than, say, Catholicism, where, the Pope is the boss, the priest is the one who talks to God, not everyone else listening.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And Pentecostalism is a fascinating case study because as you're saying, over the last century, we've had a form of Christianity that is very shamanic. And as I argue in the book, I think often is you have people who, if it were any other tradition, we would clearly define as shamans, people who are channeling a sky god, speaking in tongues, experiencing an altered state, healing and divining. That is a shaman by most anthropological definitions. Um, but so yes, exactly. That I think is a great example of this force, of this
Mhm.
tendency.
And why is there this tendency to have a more centralized versus decentralized and experiential tug of war, or sort of battle or competition over how that people in a society in general express a religion? Should we think of it just in terms of, say, the competition for social status? Obviously, if someone can centralize authority and status and power under themselves, they'll naturally tend to consolidate that power and try and reinforce that structure. But also at the same time, other people are naturally going to want to have access to these non-ordinary states, or acquire status, and so then there'll be a push for other people to disintegrate that centralized structure. And so it's really all just sort of a push-pull and a rubbing against each other of different social forces, which just amounts to different groups of people, jockeying for status space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very tenable explanation for what's going on, that it's a competition over status and power, that to control the relationship with the divine and the services that come out of that relationship is a form of power. And if there are other people in the society who can now engage with the supernatural and use that engagement for healing, divination, prophecy, whatever, then they are potential competitors. And so you want to prevent that.
Hmm.
And that is, I think thinking about it through that lens helps us understand the rise of Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism blossoms at a time, the rise of Pentecostalism coincides with the spread of the freedom of religion. You have a norm that essentially diffuses across the world where states can no longer use their authority to control religion, to dictate a particular religion, and that coincides with the spread of a very charismatic, shamanic kind of tradition. So in the book, I talk about the example of Italy, where during the first half of the 20th century, Pentecostalism is really controlled, subjugated, oppressed, clamped down on in Italy. But then, because of international norms, Italy has to take on, it has to conform to a freedom of religion. It has to infuse that into its institutions. Then that lifts the pressure on Pentecostalism, and it can flourish in the same way that it has in
Mm.
other societies.
So the structure of a society, in terms of its like literal laws and regulations and how they're enforced, that is something akin to the physical environment. If we use the biological evolution analogy, so the regulatory or legal structures of the society provide the selective pressure for certain things to blossom or get suppressed.
Exactly. Yes, certainly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I want to give a sense. I want to give people a sense for traditional shamanism and some of its key elements. And obviously, there's many examples that you can draw on from your own experience and just from your knowledge to give people a sense for these things. But sort of the overarching thing I want to have in mind here is, A, who becomes the shaman in a society, and B, what are the types of things they do? So do you want to just start with some examples that come to mind that might illustrate for people first, the types of people in a society that tend to become shamans, and whether or not there's any commonalities there across time and space?
Yeah, so that's incredibly variable. Um, I can give you an example from where I do fieldwork. So
Mhm.
I've done a lot of fieldwork in Indonesia on this island Siberut off the west coast of Sumatra. And there are even in that single society, you have a number of ways of becoming a shaman. So one is you become very sick, you kind of start to rave, you become a little strange, um, and you might go into the forest and you come back and it's thought that you're selected, or you become very, very sick, you go to the edge of death. Um, but then the shamans will try everything to heal you, but then there's some indication that, or it's taken as an indication that you should become a shaman. So that's another. I would say, though, the most common one where I do fieldwork is you want to become a shaman. You seek out a teacher. You are trained in the songs, in the herbal medicine, And then you observe various kinds of self-denial and ascetic practices. You have a number of ceremonies that are public in which you are killing lots of pigs, you're dancing, there's a lot of going into trance. Um, but really central to that, and I think this is really central to a lot of societies, are rituals to essentially turn you into a different kind of human or give you the powers that are necessary. So in Mentawai, a big part of becoming a shaman, or as they call them, sikere, is that you're believed to have eyes that normal humans do not. You're believed to be able to see souls, to see spirits, to see ghosts. And so a bunch of the shamanic initiation involves the magical treatment of your eyes, giving your eyes this special power. Um, and this facet of the shamanic initiation, I think, despite all the variation you see across cultures, this is a very important element. Um, the
So
ways that,
whether or not something happens to you that was outside of our control, you fall ill literally, or you almost die, or you just raise your hand and sort of say, I think I might like to become a shaman. Somehow, some way, something happens, and there's an initiation process you have to do, or certain things have to happen to you, and then you become this different type of person within the society.
yes, exactly. So I think even when well, it depends on, so I think very frequently a part of the shamanic initiation involves some kind of practice to promote a sense that you have powers that normal people do not, and that is through you essentially becoming a different kind of human, or you having different body parts.
Mm-hmm.
So the examples are, again, they take many forms. Australia has these really striking examples, Aboriginal Australia did, where it was said that initiates would be taken into the desert. They would cut them open, they would open them up, they would replace their skeleton with a different skeleton, or they might put crystals inside. Death and rebirth initiations or death and rebirth ceremonies are common. Um,
Yeah, but
mm,
something happens, and it's
yeah,
all
something happens that
yeah,
fundamentally transforms you, that there's an
yeah,
essential transformation.
yeah, and this kind of thing pops up all over the place at all points in history, even in nominally secular societies, right? Where there are parts of our culture where some people do something and then they're changed into this other kind of thing. You go through a graduation ceremony after finishing medical school, and now you're this special kind of person, literally in this case, a healer. But we can think of many, many examples, even in the modern age. But this is sort of the motif for whatever reason. Someone has to be initiated into this, and that involves doing or experiencing certain things. And then they either have skills or knowledge that they didn't have before, and that the other people in the society don't have. You're somehow special or different now.
Yeah. The way in which I would draw a distinction between a graduation and a lot of shamanic initiations is that for a lot of shamanic initiations, there is also a sense of why this person has fundamental abilities or powers that other people do not. So it's not only about knowledge, but it's essentially about
Mm-hmm.
powers. And so an analogy that I draw in the book there is actually in CEO/tech culture, where there's a lot of insistence on really severe and in many ways kind of shamanic practices, self-denial, even like psychedelic regimes or infrared bathing or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of the narratives that you find there, I think in particular about self-denial. Self-denial is something you find in a lot of shamanism. To
Yeah.
cultivate your powers, you have to deny yourself food in some kind of particular way or sex. And then you see the insistence on strange dietary regimes that often involve self-denial. Um, you have very similar intuitions that by engaging in this kind of self-control, you are cultivating abilities, you are becoming a different kind of person, and that allows you to do things that normal people cannot. It allows you to,
Hmm.
it increases the likelihood that you can produce the miraculous or the superhuman.
Yeah.
And I think you find it because people have that intuition. They have the intuition, if I deny myself, then I cultivate these abilities. But they also have the intuition that other people will think that I have special abilities or that I can do better things, that it kind of builds this charismatic
Yeah.
persona if I engage in
Yeah.
these practices.
Yeah, and there's many examples we could point to this very day, but one that comes to mind as you put things out that way was, famously Steve Jobs, the so-called reality distortion field. He was thought to just have this charisma. No one knew exactly what it was, but it was some kind of special sauce. And he did kind of do weird diet stuff and things like that. But in our own culture today, right, he's viewed as this person that was just different, special. It had something akin to magical powers.
Right, right. Forgetting the person who's the Theranos person. What was her name?
Oh, Elizabeth Holmes.
Elizabeth Holmes. So Elizabeth Holmes, I think, is another great example where both she engaged in a weird dietary regime. She presumably just had green juice, which, as far as I understand, you cannot actually subsist on.
That doesn't
Um,
no.
but then there was also a lot of narrative. I remember the New Yorker piece that first about her described her. I think it was a quote from like Henry Kissinger or someone who described her as a ghost or
Mm,
ghost-like. She learned Chinese in high school. It was all of these things about not only her having these special abilities, but she almost being a different kind of being.
right, right, and you see that popping up all over today. A very good example, I think, right now, in this moment of culture, is someone like Brian Johnson, the "Don't Die" guy, and he's becoming this, the supposed healthiest person in the world, and he's doing all of these weird and different things, including that involve aspects of self-denial. And despite the claims and transparency, there's a lot of secrecy there. Like the exact protocol, the exact knowledge pool that everything's being drawn from is, in our modern parlance, it's proprietary information that only he knows or his company knows. But it's this shamanic notion that this person has this sort of secret knowledge, and he's doing these rituals or these things, and thereby becomes a different kind of person.
Yes, exactly. And this is like a big thesis or theme of the book, where I wouldn't call these individuals literal shamans,
Mm-hmm.
but the practices that they're engaging in have these very strong analogies because we're all humans and we all draw similar intuitions on the basis of particular practices and behaviors. And that leads you to have these convergences, even when I think we're predisposed to think that shamanism is something so strange and foreign.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I want to get back to traditional shamanism, and maybe you can give us some of your favorite examples from history of just key illustrative shamanic practices, where the shaman is, I don't know, healing someone in some way. Can you just give some examples that illustrate how this looks in practice in traditional societies?
Yeah, so very often you have it concerns illness. I can give examples from different parts of my fieldwork. So if we go back to Mentawai, you have these cicadae, and so now they've gone through these.
Which is where?
So Mentawai is in Indonesia, off the west coast of Sumatra.
Mhm.
If any of your listeners are big surfers, they'll know the Mentawais. The Mentawais are these big surf spots. I call the islands Mentawai, the Mentawai, because that's closer to what the Mentawai say, to what the inhabitants say. But anyway, um, so there, they almost a big part of what they deal with is illness. And then there are different models for illness. Oh, you're sick because you broke a taboo. Oh, you're sick because the crocodile spirit is attacking you for not sharing meat. Oh, you're sick because you ran into the forest spirit after you cut a tree. Oh, you're sick because of sorcery or witchcraft. Um, and so then they will treat different illnesses, or they'll treat your illness using these different models. So you might call them over. They will maybe apply some herbal remedies. They will try to treat taboo violations. Then some animals will be sacrificed. Then they will try to, perhaps you're sick because you lost your soul. Maybe you fell out of a canoe and it's believed that your soul went away. They'll call your soul. But the paradigmatic, the quintessential practice among the Mentawai is something called Lajo Simagre, and it happens at night. And so throughout the day, they've been doing all kinds of different healing practices. Animals have been sacrificed, but now the night starts. And then they will dance. Someone will take out python skin drums or lizard skin drums. They will heat those next to the fire, and then they'll play those. And then the shamans will tr- uh, um, kind of trot around in circles. They will drum to the sound with their feet, kind of like a tap dancing, and then they will enter trance. It will be believed that people's souls and good spirits are coming to the dance floor. Um, these are good for healing. If I lost my soul and that's why I'm sick, then my soul is coming back to my body. But as those are approaching the shamans, then they're entering trance. And then this can go on all night. They will dance. But at some point, they will stop dancing, and then other people will dancing, and it will go from a healing ceremony into a celebration. Um, and this is something I found so striking in Mentawai, or among the Mentawai, where I think I had this impression or intuition of healing as something that's often somber and solemn. You know,
Hmm.
we're sad, and there is some of that, but it is also very celebratory. It's a lot of people coming out, they're feasting together, and then the shamans are dancing and they're healing you, and they're healing in a way that is very theatrical. Um, Other people are entering trance, and then it's a party, and then everyone is staying up all night. You know, they're drinking coffee, they're trying to stay up. Other people are dancing, they're laughing, and then it's the morning. It's 6 a.m. and they close it out. Um, so that's one example. If I wanted to generalize to other contexts, I would say, I mean, it's very hard to generalize. So I can give you a very different example. So this is from the Piaroa, on the border of Venezuela and Colombia, or Colombia, and over there, shamans. So among the Mentawai, shamans don't really take hallucinogens or any psychoactive substances other than smoking tobacco, but in the same way that many people are smoking tobacco. They enter trance through dancing. Among the Piaroa, they take a psychedelic snuff, yopo. So it's has some bufotenine, some probably mostly bufotenine, maybe a little 5-MeO, a little DMT. Um, they take that. They might sip Yahe, copy the MAOI. Um, and it'll be a smaller ceremony, maybe a patient, some members of the patient's family, maybe several shamans, maybe just one, maybe a shaman and their apprentice. They will take the psychedelics, and then they will diagnose the illness. They will see which witches or which sorcerers are causing your illness. They might confront them. They might battle them. You know, you might enter these states just to diagnose, but you can also enter these states to to treat. And then they might come out, you know, it might be several hours, and it might be decided, okay, you know, this patient is sick because someone is causing witchcraft. Then we'll go to like a waterfall, we'll bathe them to protect them. That's a different version. And the two contexts are actually what they share is altered states and engagement with unseen agents,
Hmm. Hmm.
but they're very different in the extent to which they're
Yeah.
social, and how
Yeah,
many shamans are maybe sometimes involved.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the common denominator here is the shaman, the special person who has the special who can do things that ordinary people can't. They are doing the methods vary, but they're doing something. They're deploying, various techniques. Maybe it's a psychedelic trance, maybe it's dance that induces trance, maybe it's chanting, maybe it's whatever, but it's inducing this altered state that's then enabling them to engage in some type of healing process. And it's often focused on healing something that's wrong with an individual or a group. That's one core aspect, this sounds like.
Yeah. I think healing is the most common. You also often have forms of divination. They might be possessed by a spirit, and people can ask that spirit what's going on in a community, or they might leave their body and go commune with a god or an agent to understand what's going to happen. And then you have other ways of dealing with misfortune or uncertainty, um, inviting game, controlling harvests, helping with economic success or diagnosing economic success. But nevertheless, I think the most common thing is healing.
Mm-hmm. So healing is probably the most common, but there's also this other aspect of dealing with uncertainty. Like, are the crops going to come on time? Is a storm going to destroy something? It's dealing with unforeseen events.
Yeah, so among the Mentawe, the Sikere will do this while after they sacrifice the animals. So they'll sacrifice a pig or a chicken, and then they'll take out its heart, or they'll look at its intestines, um, and divine in that way. So in Mentawe, divination does not involve altered states. In other contexts, it does. But these two, healing and divination, are probably the most, are not probably, are definitively the most important features of shamanic traditions across cultures.
Mm-hmm. And so the techniques vary, but are there any? And I guess one thing for people to keep in mind is, like, just in biology, right, where we, for convenience and because to some extent it's true, we have all of these categories and names that we give things for taxonomic purposes, like we talk about mammals versus birds. There's a real distinction there, but we can list off the characteristics of mammals, but there's always exceptions. There's the one mammal over there that lays eggs, or the one mammal over there that doesn't really have fur, or whatever. There's exceptions, and there's variability, and there's variation. So maybe not, a few things are truly universal, but there's a lot of commonalities, even though the specifics of how these things express vary so much from culture to culture.
Yeah, yeah. I- And I would say, so the three defining features that we put forward at the beginning are found in all shamanic traditions. They're what define it: engagement with unseen realities, altered states, services like healing and divination. I don't know if we mentioned that when defining it, but yeah, so those you find everywhere. You do find other commonalities, and I can quickly just list some.
Yeah.
Um, so asceticism, self-denial is a common one. Dramatic initiations, initiations that are believed to fundamentally transform the initiate. Beliefs or an expectation that they have other special powers. So shamans everywhere are believed in some way to engage with unseen agents, but then they might also be believed to fly, to transform into animals, to have some control over fire. Um, so yeah, that is another one.
Are they usually are
Um,
they usually are they usually considered to be higher status? And is it always a small minority of the people in a traditional culture who are shamans?
Great question. I would say they're often higher status, but they might also be liminal, like someone who's more liminal. In Mentawai, they're quite high status. They're understood to be very attractive. Um, and then your second question was,
Is it always a small
oh yeah, is
minority
it
of
a
people
small
who
number?
become shamans? Are they truly special, or can sort of anyone or a large number of people potentially become a shaman?
It's very variable. So you'll have some societies where a single person might be a shaman, but then you'll have groups like the Kung San, the Jutwansi, one of these so-called Bushman people in the Kalahari, former hunter-gatherers, where many people would be believed or would have the capacity to enter trance. It was still believed that there are some individuals who are particularly good healers, but the Jutwansi are an interesting example because shamanic power was much more egalitarian. So I would say it really runs the gamut.
Mhm.
I would say, nevertheless, that the Jutwansi are a bit exceptional, that for the most part, I think it's more constrained. It's not that everyone has this ability.
And so, non-ordinary states, this is always a part of shamanism, but the specifics around how that's happening vary quite a bit, it sounds like. How common is the intentional ingestion of psychoactive substances?
So I believe you said you had Winkleman on here. So from what I recall, Winkleman and I disagree a bunch about shamanism, but I find he built this database in the 1980s that I find very useful. And so, according to Winkleman's database, if I recall correctly, about in half of societies, trance practitioners use psychoactive substances in uh, in trance states. And so that's very broad use: marijuana, opiates. I forget if tobacco was in there, other hallucinogens. So yeah, I would say roughly, according to that data, roughly half of society's shamans are using psychoactive substances. One thing I push against in the book, though, is that I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, especially now, to talk about the frequency with which psychedelics in
Mhm.
particular are used across societies. You'll find claims like psychedelics are used around the world and have been used for millennia. But if we're talking about classic psychedelics, serotonergic psychedelics, there's very, very little evidence. The best evidence would suggest it was um, a a portion of societies from the Rio Grande and southwards. You have no other place in the world where you have reliable evidence of classic psychedelics used in shamanic contexts.
See, so if we're specific with the terminology here, a serotonergic psychedelic would be something like DMT, and so ayahuasca would be an example of such an agent.
Yeah, ayahuasca,
Yeah,
peyote, these
but
snuffs.
yeah, but some of these other psychedelic or psychedelic-like substances that might be used around the world. Maybe iboga would be an example we could talk about. They're not serotonergic. We can go deep into the science. I don't think that's our purpose here, but people have used psychoactive substances of various
Yes.
kinds. Quite a lot. It's not always the case. That what I'm sort of taking away from you is that the shaman is always going to enter into non-ordinary states for his or her purposes, and they'll probably use whatever tools and techniques are at their disposal in that particular part of the world.
Yes, right, exactly. Dancing, darkness, seclusion, um, and psychoactive substances, sometimes drumming.
Mm-hmm. And so, you say in the book that shamanism is a near inevitability of human societies, and I think this is tied to just the natural psychological dispositions that people have. Can you start to talk about that a little bit? One place to start could be this idea that, because we're social primates, we're social, right? We have to interact with each other, and that requires our minds to be able to assign and deal with agency. You can choose to do things and say things, and I have to interact with you and other people, and therefore our minds are predisposed to detect agency in the world. And for example, one school of thought is that our monkey brains are just sort of primed to detect agency in the world, and that's why we have beliefs about spirits and the supernatural and all of that stuff. Can you start to talk about that a little bit, where some of these inclinations come from?
Exactly. Yeah. Certainly, I think you started to describe it really well. So we can start by talking about the psychological or cognitive foundations of religion more broadly. And I mentioned these two: beliefs in supernatural agents, unseen forces, or supernatural agents, and then practices to engage with them to control misfortune. And like you're saying, across societies, very reliably, people believe that supernatural agents exist, and not only that they exist, but that they are often involved, or that they oversee events that are uncontrollable, events that are uncertain, important, um, and which resolve randomly. Illness, the weather. Uh, it is very hard to find a society where you do not have people who suspect that illness and the weather, catastrophes, misfortune, are shaped by invisible agents. And like you're saying, a prevailing theory is this one that is the hyperactive agency detection. There's debate over what that looks like cognitively, but the general finding that people are predisposed, that probably because we are hypersocial animals, and it really benefits us to spot agency in the world, and agency is ubiquitous and important. As a result, we're maybe a bit promiscuous in spotting agency, and that leads or supports these beliefs in supernatural agents. So I think that is one really important cognitive foundation.
Mm-hmm. And so when we think about the shamanism and what the shaman is doing and what exactly the services the shaman provides are for, on the surface level, we talk about things like, well, the shaman is trying to, exorcise a demon from this person, or the shaman is trying to, bring forth a good harvest this year or something like that. But I wonder how much of these things, what's actually happening is there is some kind of psychological process happening where engagement in these rituals and in these practices is providing some kind of psychological catharsis. And so what you sort of mentioned there is a lot of people naturally have anxieties around important things and unpredictable things. And especially when you have big, important things that can be very consequential, but you can't predict them, like the weather, right? Naturally, because it's random, or at least not readily predictable. That brings negative affective states to people that they're naturally going to want to control and get rid of, right? We don't like feeling bad. And so can you start to think about shamanism and some of these practices and services that the shaman is providing to people as a kind of psychological catharsis and a ritualistic way of managing emotions?
Interesting. Yeah. So we can start with the observation, which is that people very often will engage in rituals or practices to control these uncertain outcomes, important and uncontrollable. This is magic. This is superstition. And so then the question is why. And so you're articulating one hypothesis, which is that they relieve anxiety. That when confronted with events that are very consequential and important, but over which we have no control, it makes us feel better. It alleviates our anxiety if we are at least doing something. If we are at least trying out a rain ritual or whatever. I think that hypothesis is a bit complicated or doesn't tell us the whole story. And one reason is that I don't think it's necessarily always the case that going to a shaman makes a person less anxious.
Hmm.
And again, I want to remind us, or I want to bring up the entanglement of shamanism and witchcraft.
Mm.
So someone might go to a shaman and then they might converge on a narrative that your illness is being caused by your father who is causing witchcraft, or
Hmm.
that neighbor who has attacked you, and I am going to enter the state and I'm going to spot them and I'm going to fight their sorcery, or I'm going to suck out whatever bullet that they have thrown into you from afar, some magical bullet. Now you'll come out of that and you might feel better, or you might feel like the source of that illness has been removed, but you at the same time will potentially come out and be distrustful of social intimates, of
Hmm.
a family member, of your neighbor.
Hmm.
And
But
so it's not,
the shaman is in, it sounds like the shaman is basically in the business of providing narratives to people to structure their beliefs about what they experience.
or I would say that they co-create them.
Hmm.
So, the shamanism is contributing some, the shaman is contributing some, the patient comes with their own expectations or understanding. And it could also be the case that they cycle through,
Hmm. Hmm.
okay, it
But
might be
yeah,
A,
but
let's try A didn't work.
through these practices with, in consultation with the shaman, there is a structuring of someone's beliefs about the world so that they can navigate them one way or the other. It's going to influence how they interpret events and what they think is going on, and therefore how they behave with other people.
Yes, yes. And it's often agent-centered explanations of misfortune, which I
Hmm.
think are very cognitively sticky. Um, so another way of viewing why people engage in these rituals is what we might call a bet hedging theory, that
Hmm.
that the potential benefit is quite high. I don't get sick. The rain, we control when rain comes, and the potential cost compared to that benefit is relatively low. My mother survives versus I go to a shaman and sacrifice a chicken. That is a very small cost compared to this potential benefit. And sometimes when I do engage in this action, that benefit does occur. And so there are people who argue that um, our psychology has evolved in such a way that we are predisposed to use low cost interventions to try to influence high stakes outcomes, especially when we sometimes get confirmatory evidence, because if you have that tendency on average, you will find useful causal
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, maybe this psychology sustains superstition, but it also actually allows me to stop myself from eating important food, or,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
otherwise drawing
I,
causal connections that
yeah.
are
I mean, I
useful.
wonder if there's something here too where establishing a ritual, doing a set of things a particular way, um, in virtue of what that, if you're engaged in ritualistic behavior, you're doing a sequence of behaviors in a particular context, right? That's going to put you in a brain state that's different than if you're just, if you don't have that kind of ritual, you don't have that consistency, and so it could actually have performance effects. So if you think about, say, an athlete who has a ritual that he does every time he takes a free throw shot, I bet I suspect, just knowing what I know about reinforcement and animal learning, and how brain states tie into behavioral performance, I bet if you had Michael Jordan take 100 shots doing his ritual and then 100 shots not doing the ritual, he might be a few percentage points or even more with the ritual there, because it's putting his brain in a state that's better able to then execute the motor action that is goal directed.
Yeah, I mean that seems plausible, and I think another mechanism for explaining an outcome like that is the first one that you described. So there is experimental evidence, or there's both experimental evidence and kind of retrospective evidence suggesting that engaging in rituals does reduce anxiety, and I think there are
Mm-hmm.
probably therapeutic benefits to that, and that might also help you in performance. So I don't want to reject the possibilities of those things, but at the same time I do find compelling this kind of bet hedging idea that the world is a chaotic place, and
There's
so you might
low
as
cost to
well.
engage in the shamanic behavior, high potential payoff for this sort of high stakes, unpredictable thing.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Um, and but we can talk about this more generally. But I think there are many, aside from these things that we're laying out, there are also, I think, independent reasons to suspect that shamanic rituals do provide various therapeutic benefits or therapeutic effects. Which also might further sustain people going to them. At the same time, I think they're also potentially costly in a number of ways. I wouldn't want to monolithically frame them as therapeutic and beneficial. We talked
Mhm.
about the witchcraft, but I think there are other potential benefits that might sustain them
Mhm.
or that might contribute to people continuing to use them.
Can you talk a little bit more about this competition between centralized and decentralized expression of spiritual practices? And are there certain conditions that favor a more shamanic expression versus a more centralized one, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think it's how much power can you centralize? And so you could see this in Polynesia. There's great work on Polynesia where you can see the trade-off between, or the competition between chiefly power and shamans. So in parts of Polynesia that have very strong chiefly power, you see very few shamans because chiefs are not only secular authorities, but they were also divine authorities. Whereas in parts of Polynesia where chiefly power could not extend, so the farthest parts of the Hawaiian archipelago or other parts of Hawaii, and in those contexts, you would find more shamanism. I'll say that it's not always the case that centralized authorities quash shamanism. They will also sometimes try to domesticate it. So you see
Mm,
this in the history of Japan,
yeah.
where in Japan you have mediums known as miko. They're shamanic mediums. They are possessed, and then in their possession they might heal people or prophecy. And Buddhism has had a long competition with the miko. Um, the Miko is a very compelling, experientially powerful, locally attractive means of getting healed and engaging with the divine. And so ultimately, what Buddhism did was domesticating the Miko, bringing the Miko into the Buddhist fold. You put them at the temples, you weaken it, you remove its power.
Mm.
Um,
So,
and
so,
so then
so,
you,
yeah. So when power centralizes, to the extent power is centralizing an individual or a group, they'll naturally want to keep or grow that power. And part of doing that means dealing with your competition. And so one strategy to deal with ascendant forms of potential power that you don't want to challenge yours is to quash it, to deal with it directly and bluntly and even violently. But there are more subtle and gentle ways that certain cultures have certain forms of centralized power in some cultures have dealt with this competition problem.
yeah, yeah. And some cultures have said that trance and altered states are no longer legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
Others have said that only a couple individuals can enter trance or altered states. We want to centralize shamanism in particular places. There is an interesting implication, though, of a lot of this where in very hierarchical societies, you find women actually very often becoming shamans.
Hmm.
And the argument has been that in those contexts, there's a lot of control over religious expression. But then for two reasons, women can kind of open up a local space. One is that the women are very often treating women, that a lot of this competition is going on essentially in the world of men. And so you have these women possessed cults where you have women shamans who yeah, are often treating women. But then the other is that the form of shamanism that you find is one where you often have kind of violent spirits coming into people and those people developing relationships where they come to control them. And that maybe in societies where certain individuals tend to be subjugated or oppressed more, that creates an opportunity for them to have a relationship with spirits that powerful people cannot, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I
yeah.
mean, so on the theme that there's this sort of cyclical tendency because you've got effectively competition between two kinds of forces, one is centralizing and one the more decentralized or shamanic force, whatever you want to call it. You're going to see this play out over and over again in different periods of history and in different ways. And of course, the details will always differ, but a general prediction here would be that anywhere that you've had strong centralization in religion for a long time, the sort of potential energy will probably build up to break that and for something new to be unleashed that's more decentralized, and vice versa. I imagine that if things are too too out there the other way for some time, eventually a centralizing figure will emerge to reconfigure that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you see this even in the history of Christianity. Christianity starts off a very charismatic and ecstatic tradition. I mean, the day of Pentecost is people speaking in tongues. Paul is always writing about the gift of tongues, the gift of prophecy, the gift of healing. But then over the first century, you have a turn against charisma. You have the centralizing of religious authority in the bishop. But then you even have in the second century AD, new upstarts. You have this movement called Montanism, which is a charismatic kind of shamanic religion where you have trans prophets and you have competition then between the bishops and the new church and the Montanists. It's something that Christianity has experienced throughout its history from the beginning. I mean, Shakers and
Yeah.
Quakers are
Right,
defined
right. Just
on
the
the
split
basis
between,
of being
yeah.
ecstatic,
I
being
mean, the split
shaking and
between
being
Catholicism
quaking.
and Protestantism seems to fit here, right? The Protestants were the people that didn't want all the authority concentrated in, the popes and the bishops, and they wanted to talk directly to God and read the Bible directly. So you do see this basically everywhere you look, this type of tension.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
What about very, very early Christianity? Jesus himself, the basis for Christianity, was Jesus a shamanic character in some ways?
Yeah. So this is something I talk about a bunch in the book. And
I did not get to that part, but
yeah, so in short, maybe without um, spoiling too much, I argue that there are many reasons that we should suspect not only that Jesus was a roughly shamanic character, but that he was probably quite literally a shaman.
hmm,
Um, the most difficult thing I'll admit, and I'm not the first person to put forward this claim. There are a number of scholars who have argued that Jesus was probably possessed and potentially entered these altered states. I would say the hardest thing to demonstrate using the Gospels, for example, is that he entered kind of ecstatic, altered states. And so in the book, I go through some evidence for why it's at least reasonable to suspect that.
can you give us a
But
basic sense for that? Why might you suspect that?
Okay, so I think there are a number of reasons. One is that the Eastern Mediterranean, we knew that the Eastern Mediterranean was a very shamanic place.
Hmm.
The Hebrew prophets, um, I think there's good reason to conclude that the Hebrew prophets were a good number of them were shamans. We know that the Greco-Roman world had shamans. I mean, the oracle at Delphi was
Hmm.
very clearly a shaman, someone who's possessed, and in possession is engaging with probably Apollo and then divining. I mean, that's a clear shaman. So we know the Greco-Roman world was shamanic. We knew that the Israelites probably were shamanic. We know that Mesopotamia had these prophet figures who divined in altered states, probably very
Hmm.
shamanic.
Hmm. I
So
suppose
just
I
at its
suppose even
basic,
I
yeah.
suppose even in the absence of direct evidence that Jesus would have directly entered into non-ordinary states. Whether or not that's true, this is certainly a case where you're talking about a charismatic individual talking directly with all of the people outside of the confines of the formal power structure that was kind of ruling that society at the time.
Yeah, without even getting into the evidence, I think exactly we have a place that was very clearly shamanic,
Hmm.
or a general cultural region. Um, and we have an individual who's defined by healing and divination and engagement with non-ordinary realities. He's channeling or engaging with the Holy Spirit. He's removing demons, and he's doing that for healing, and he's very often divining. So just on the basis of, if we're anthropologists, and we're just going on the basis of basic inference, I think the starting hypothesis is not that, oh, he's exceptional and peculiar in this way, but that as you would have for most prophet healers in this particular part of the world at this particular time, we would expect them to be shamanic. Um, then there are passages in the Gospels that we can look at, and I analyze a couple following other scholars. Other scholars have analyzed the Gospels and looked for this evidence. I mean, the Gospels are very tricky. They're already coming out at a time past the early Christian church. We would have probably already expected there to be a turn against trance. But nevertheless, there are interesting indications, even in there, where, he's called to heal, while healing, is accused of being possessed. A flock of people goes to him. His family and intimates are holding him. Um, Again, these are passages that other scholars have taken as evidence potentially of spirit possession in the context of healing. I'm just following them. And so this is essentially the approach. It's to go on the basis both of textual evidence, but also just the general ethnography of that time and place.
Hmm. Hmm. And so I guess one takeaway here is that it's problematic to think of shamanic religions and non-shamanic religions, because when you look at the history of any given religious tradition, different facets of it, different sub disciplines within it would have had a more shamanic expression and others not. It's this sort of living, moving, dynamic thing. It's not Christianity and then shamanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I taught a class on shamanism last quarter, and I was just looking at materials online, and I found this phylogeny of of world religions, and
Mhm.
so many of the phylogeny of world religions had modern world religions starting in some kind of Pleistocene or archaic time with shamanism. Whereas the alternative is exactly what you're saying. I think that shamanism is an element of religion that you find just manifesting being oppressed. Um, yeah.
And it's yeah. So there's it's this moving thing. It's one way that any given religion could potentially be expressed, as opposed to other ways it could be expressed. You talked in the book about you had a line in the beginning where you said you've chased modern resurrections of shamanism from Harvard Square to the Nevada deserts. What are you referring to there? Where do we see in today's technological, modern, nominally secular world in many ways? Where do we see these modern resurrections of shamanism?
So the two that I'm talking about over there are both very explicitly neo-shamans. So or strands of neo-shamanism. And these are people who very often identify themselves as shamans. So in Harvard Square, there's the Cambridge Shamanic Circle, so I did my PhD at Harvard, and a short bike ride from campus is the Quaker House. And potentially still now, at least when I was doing my PhD, they would have a shamanic circle. The Nevada desert is a reference to Burning Man. And so in the book, I talk about Shaman Dome at Burning Man. And Shaman Dome actually traces its you might say, shamanic lineage to the same figures and movement that the Cambridge Shamanic Circle and much of neo-shamanism does today, which is something called core shamanism. It was developed by the anthropologist turned neo-shamanic guru Michael Harner. Um, and so there's a lot of debate over is neo-shamanism should we treat that as shamanism? Is it fair to call it shamanism, or is it some kind of corruption or um,
Mhm.
mockery of shamanism?
Yeah,
And so something in the book I try to figure out is by going into these spaces and analyzing them and trying to understand, are they shamanic?
yeah. So you had to go to Burning Man for work.
Yeah. 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 We can say
Interesting.
that.
Yeah, so I mean, on this theme that it's not shamanism and religion, and they're two separate things. We're talking about a dynamic evolutionary process. We're talking about cultural phenotypes that morph and change over time. One way that you talked about this is, you refer to shamanism as a technology. What does that mean to think about something like a social technology or to think about cultural technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think about shamanism foremost as a cognitive technology. And this came partly from, I think a lot of people wanted to know, do I like shamanism? Do I think it's good? Do I think it's bad? And I felt that those are not the right questions. Shamanism is a package of practices and associated beliefs that is hyper compelling as a way of dealing with uncertainty. Um, and so I think the best way to analyze it is as a very powerful cognitive technology, a set of practices that people engage in, and it has some kind of cognitive effects. It gives them a sense of control over uncertainty, and it promotes a perception that other individuals are superhuman, and that can be used for good, but that can also be used for exploitation. And shamanic practices are used for both all around the world and in different contexts. So I think and again, if we come back to the modern context and we think about or we think about in industrialized societies, we think about tech culture where people are using these practices to promote a perception that they're different from humans. Um, I think they can use that for exploitation. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried, I think we have a good sense, was pretty deliberate about promoting a persona of him as a bit, I don't even like kooky feels like the wrong
Yeah.
word, but
So he was
maybe
special. He
even
was different in some way. He could see right. He could see the market or whatever. He could see the way that the bones were falling and what it meant.
yes, exactly. And I remember while all of that was coming out, it came out that there was discussion about should he cut his hair, and he
Hmm.
considered his hair being wild and brambly to be positive EV or high expected value. There was the time that he showed up, I think, at a Senate committee or somewhere in Congress with his shoes barely like half tied, or they were tied in this absurd knot. And I think all of those, they were effective at promoting a sense of like this guy doesn't care about everyday norms, but he has some kind of insight into some otherwise unseen market
Hmm.
trends.
So the
But
eccentric
it
the
came out
eccentric
that
CEO motif that we see today is in some sense just like an echo of the same. We have this disposition to view these special people because they look this way or they act this way. They're eccentric people in some way. We tend to ascribe them powers that ordinary people don't have.
exactly. We're predisposed to think that individuals who deviate from normal humanness have abilities that other people do not. Um, and I think that can be used for good, but I think it can also be used for exploitation. And so in this way, I think all of the practices comprising shamanism are better analyzed as a technology than as some morally coded,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if like one of the things that came up for me, especially when we were talking about how in shamanism you often have these ritual practices which are engaged in oftentimes for the purposes of healing. I couldn't help but think of things in modern Western secular medicine where maybe there's some similarities there. So the very concept, say, of a placebo, we have these what you might call rituals, right? We have clinical trial rituals, you might say. We have prescription and going to see the doctor rituals that we're supposed to do regularly. And the placebo effect is named and known because if you give someone this thing that's not real medicine, they nonetheless sometimes get better to some extent. And I wonder if that just speaks to how engaging in certain practices that one believes will bring healing is actually instigating some kind of endogenous change that actually can, in some circumstances, provide some benefit.
Yeah, I mean that brings up so much. But I want to start by I have a chapter in there. It's called Behold a Bird Head. And I started by interviewing with Glenn Treisman, who is a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. And Glenn at Hopkins, I heard about him because I have a friends or I know some people who are in the psychiatry program at Hopkins, and he's legendary there. He's legendary for being able to treat patients who otherwise seem impossible to treat. People who have pain where you can't find the biological basis, people who are paralyzed but you can't figure out why. And he considers himself a shaman. He calls himself a shaman, and he views the most important technique in there as performing essentially superhumanists or performing a kind of authority. So he goes in, he co-creates a narrative with his patients. You're sick because something biological happened to you, but I've checked it out or we've treated it, and now I have the power to heal you. I can be the one to make you walk. He calls it putting on the bird head. He even dresses up in particular ways. He wears like very loud suits. He puts on cufflinks. He really wears up. He dresses up authority in a way that is almost a bit of a caricature. Um, but that's just to say that not only do I think there is an analogy, but I think some people are very aware of it and
Hmm.
even leverage it.
Hmm.
Now, Glenn's technique, I don't know if we can call that necessarily the placebo. He's going in there, and what he's doing is he's working with the patient's story about themselves. The patient
Yeah.
comes in, they say, I am paralyzed, I can't move from this chair, and he embodies a powerful figure who is able to change your story about yourself. And I think a lot of shamans do that. You go to the shaman, I'm haunted by witches, this crocodile spirit is tormenting me. The shaman creates an incredibly vivid sensory experience to convince you that that is no longer happening, and you come out with a different story about
Hmm.
yourself. I
Hmm.
mean, this is
Yeah.
the main
This is
mechanism by which,
but I mean,
yes, it's a
it's
psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
yeah, this is
Yeah,
psychotherapy, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever. It's someone with a skill set you don't have. You go to them as a patient and they are helping you re-narrativize your life in a way that allows you to just be with it in a different way.
exactly. So I think that's one mechanism that is important in shamanism and which you also find in biomedicine. But then you bring up the placebo effect, and I agree. I think so. You highlighted belief that people go and they believe that they're being treated and that they'll get better. One thing I read about in the book, though, are and are open label placebos. Are
Mm,
you
yes,
familiar with
yes.
open labels?
Yeah, but
Yeah, and
describe this
so
for people because some won't know it and it's worth knowing.
yeah, so open label placebo is the idea that I give you a placebo and I tell you that this is a placebo. So the famous study is by Ted Kapchuk. It's with irritable bowel syndrome patients. Ted had already published an amazing paper showing strong effects of placebo for irritable bowel syndrome. But then when he looked at the interview responses from that first study where it was blinded, where people thought they were getting a treatment, he found that a lot of people did not expect to get healed. They would say things like, I
Mm,
don't know if I'll be healed. I don't know if I believe that this is going to work. But nevertheless, he found the effect, and that inspired him to actually check, well, how important is belief here even in the first place? And so
yeah.
then he ran this very well-known open blind study. There have been a number of, or the open label study, and now there have been a number of others since then. And the general finding is that even if you tell people that what they're taking is a placebo, you will still see a therapeutic
Yeah,
effect.
yeah. And I
Uh,
mean, to me, the way that I start to think about it, given my background, is there's a bag of tricks. There's a bag of different techniques one you can use, and belief is one of them. In certain contexts, for certain ailments, that belief might be necessary for some kind of therapeutic efficacy to be there. In other contexts, it might not be. Clearly, there are
right.
some contexts in which you don't even need that belief. But going through the actions is doing something clearly, and in some cases, the belief in the placebo being real is disposable.
Right, right, exactly. And I think it's worth remembering that there are many ways in which the human mind is indifferent to the reality, non-reality distinction. I mean,
Mm,
fiction is a great example. We become obsessed with characters, we think about them all the time. Our mind probably cares to a small degree whether they're real or not, but it also responds to them as if they're real, even when they're not. And I think it's probably a similar case, at least in some contexts, for being healed. Your body is going through the motions, it's going through the ritual, and whether or not you have this higher order reflective thought about, this will work or this will not, can be to some degree disposable.
yeah, yeah. Um, wow. So, uh, I mean, we've already covered a lot. What are so? I want to bring up so that this will sort of rhyme with things we've talked about already, but talk about Terence McKenna a little because in my lifetime he was probably the first. I think that's probably where I first heard the word shamanism and got introduced to some of these ideas. And so, for those who don't know, who was he, and what was this notion of an archaic revival that he was speaking to? I kind of assumed it would be somewhere in the book, but I didn't get to that part.
Okay, yeah. Um, so things can be edited out, right, Nick?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Okay,
I mean,
so
I would prefer not to, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah, well, I'm just gonna say I'm not like a super expert on Terrence McKenna, but I can try to answer this
Just
question.
whatever you know.
Okay. Um, so Terence McKenna was you might describe him as like a 20th century psychedelic mystic. He was an individual who um, he was a psychonaut. He explored the landscape of altered states, especially with psychedelics. He presented them to the masses. He wrote a lot about them. And a major theme in some of his work was the idea that human societies throughout history have used psychedelics, and some of our flaws and ailments come from not engaging in these mystical states. I think at one point he even argued that like myopia. I think at one point he even argued that myopia might be a consequence of not engaging in psychedelics as frequently. Now, Terence McKenna, I think, was um, in many ways a um, a stupendous ambassador for the psychedelic experience, for democratizing information about them, for introducing these to the masses. But I think his work did come with some mischaracterizations about the diversity of shamanism and
Mm-hmm.
about the role of psychedelics in it across societies. Um, and you again, like I mentioned this earlier, but you find this claim so often among psychedelic enthusiasts that psychedelics have been used for centuries and millennia in cultures around the world, and it projects a very simplistic image onto the diversity of spiritual traditions around the world. It also leads people to assume that shamanic altered states look the same in
Hmm.
places around the world, and that when you take psychedelics, you are experiencing what they're like. Um, and so, in line with a lot of what we're talking about, I just want to underscore just how diverse have been the techniques that shamans have used to enter non-ordinary states. And when we're talking about classic or serotonergic psychedelics in particular, just how infrequent they have been. I
Hmm.
think sometimes human diversity, human spiritual diversity, can be used as an ideological tool to push people's financial outcomes that they want, or to push the broader acceptance of psychedelics. And I'm not against the broader acceptance of psychedelics, but I am against um, caricatures of humanity as a means of doing so.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, when we use some of these terms like spirituality, say, so as a cultural anthropologist, what would you say someone's spirituality is? What is that referring to about a person in the abstract?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I think there are many definitions of spirituality. When I'm using it over here, I'm mostly using it to mean engagement with spirits or relationships with spirits. But, I think there are many people who, when they talk about their own spirituality, might say that they don't adhere to like a religious
Hmm.
metaphysics, but
Hmm.
nevertheless, they can experience
Hmm.
transcendental moments and they'll describe themselves as
Yeah.
spiritual.
One so with a lot of these ideas in mind of shamanism is not a thing that once happened in the past. It's like a way that the certain set of human tendencies can express itself, in contrast to other ways that these things can express themselves. And in contrast to the idea that many have had historically that shamanism is archaic, it's something from the past, it's no longer with us. Religion is something that evolved from it, or we ascended out of shamanism. We see, as you mentioned so many examples, we see shamanistic or shamanistic like elements in people and stuff even today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about things in today's hyper modern AI driven technological society strike me as being shamanic in a way, and even the places where the people doing these things would have the opposite characterization of what they're doing. So there are many places. I'll kind of let you take the ropes here, but when we think about scientists in some cases, making elaborate computer models that predict things like the weather, or we think about economists. If you follow anything on social media related to the stock market and economics, it's like everybody knows what's going to happen, but clearly nobody does. But we all have these gurus we look to that supposedly have the crystal ball, and so talk a little bit about some of these shamanism like expressions of these tendencies that we have in today's nominally secular society.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I call these hedge wizards. I'm careful to say that they're not shamans. They're not explicit shamans insofar as they are not entering trance, but they are very much analogous. They are individuals who are promising control over uncertain outcomes, who either will promise to provide you with a service or to divine about the future of something, and who do so mostly because of a predisposition for us to think that there's order in randomness, and to think that individuals who seem to deviate from normal humanness, or to embody our expectations of an authority, can do so. And I think the best example, as you kind of signaled, are money managers. These are individuals who there is very strong evidence do not have the ability to systematically or reliably beat the market. It's money managers don't beat themselves across years. They don't beat each other across years.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
nevertheless, that is such an enormous industry where people
Yes.
put in,
Yeah. And
yeah, I don't,
right,
it's,
a step from the outside looking in, it looks like there's a method to the madness. They have equations and
they have
models and
equations.
computer
Exactly.
programmers and quants that they've
They're
hired.
incredibly charismatic. They're barely sleeping. I
Yes.
mean, they perform
And
this power in so many ways.
yeah, and essentially what we're sort of saying here is, even though it looks from the outside in like there is a method to the madness, and even though to some extent there is or can be sometimes, that method is usually much less ordered and reliable than we're led to believe it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little evidence that it produces the kinds of outcomes that they claim for it to produce.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that can be understood in a very similar dynamic, where you have a competition among people who are trying to assure a set of clients that they can control the uncertain, and that competition leads to the evolution of techniques that are hyper compelling. Um,
Yeah, but
Yes.
I mean, even in the realm of say science explicitly, I see this type of thing happen all the time where someone says, "My answer is science based." You know, one, two, three, and they've got 10 citations, and indeed there are citations, there are papers, there's evidence that's been stitched together. But someone else will have the opposite interpretation, and it's just as learned. It's got just as many citations to it because you can stitch. It's very easy to stitch together a narrative using these component parts. And it's not a far cry that there are sort of these, what you might say are modern forms of divination that are sort of camouflaged as being the real thing. And to some extent they might be, but to a large extent I think a lot of people are just engaged in the same types of practices that we're talking about in the context of shamanism. They're just sort of dressed up with these very modern elements that are part of our society today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I think what a lot of these share in common is essentially dressing themselves up in badges and symbols of authority that convince you that they have some kind of insight that they
Yes.
otherwise wouldn't.
People want to be
Uh,
considered the guru or the shaman or the whatever.
Yes, yes, and the way that they successfully do so is by dressing up in these elements that others take as badges of credibility or authority. Something similar, though, so Kim Stanley Robinson, the sci-fi writer, lives in Davis, lives in the same town that I do, and I recently got lunch with him, and he was talking about how he is now invited to speak about a range of topics that he has very little expertise or authority over. And it seems that for him, he has written incredible speculative fiction, science fiction, and that has promoted this sense that he can see the world in a way that normal people do not, and that he thinks about the future in a way that normal people do not, and has led people to seek him out as a kind of guru, essentially, or someone who has some kind of deep insight. So I think there's an incredible hunger wherever you go um, to be able to control the uncertainty of the world. And we just have an intuition that people who are exceptional in one way probably are the best people to visit.
Hmm. Sort of broad, fuzzy question here, but when we think about the evolution of religion and sort of this competition between the more shamanic expression and the more centralized expression, all that stuff. Obviously, right now we're living in this very interesting time with AI, and AI clearly is tying into religious and spiritual concepts. People are talking about one day being able to upload your consciousness into the cloud to achieve immortality in some literal sense. It's got a lot of these religious concepts in its orbit, and so how do you see sort of what are your general thoughts on AI and how people's sort of spiritual or religious beliefs might start to evolve and shift in one direction or another, maybe a more shamanic direction versus a different kind of expression as it relates to AI?
Oh, interesting. So my first thought is maybe less about shamanism, but more I think that AI promotes a sense that that institutions can do more than they already can,
Mm-hmm.
which, if anything, I imagine will just feed conspiratorial thinking. It will promote a sense that the kinds of misfortunes or, the systems that we're confronting are attributable to algorithms. I mean, I think like when I think about religious expression in modern America, I think about probably the most prominent thing is this kind of new mystical Christianity that has elements of the far right, that has elements of QAnon, which is very conspiratorial. And I think the rising power of AI will most credibly feed into that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you see some of the major religions here I mean, you can talk about anywhere, but we're both here in the United States. That's obviously what a lot of people will be most familiar with. How do you see the expression of traditional religions changing moving forward? We take any example you want, but Christianity, for example, do you see it moving a little bit more in one direction or another, given the current cultural context and where you might see us in terms of like where we are in that battle between the shamanic expression versus the centralized?
I mean, I think we're definitely on the more shamanic expression right now. American Christianity is super decentralized. It's very easy for new figures to emerge. It's very difficult to clamp down on them. You have a lot of individuals who call themselves prophets. You have Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical churches that can compete with each other. I think this moment in the United States and around the world is the moment for shamanism and related decentralized religions. Um,
Does that set us up with a kind of potential energy for some kind of religious revival in the other direction? It's this recurring theme that I see in, I mean, history writ large, but in the U.S. as well, where you have these religious revivals where a new expression sort of pops up and things wax and wane. If we're in a sort of high shamanic state right now, state of expression, does that mean that at some point, relatively soon, the pendulum might start to swing the other way?
yeah, well, I mean, I think even to use a biology example, maybe a weird example, but I even think there are predator-prey dynamics going on over here where you have
Hmm.
waxing and waning and competition and diffusion where so over the last couple of days I've been really in the um, kind of you might call it prophetic populism space
Hmm.
where you
Hmm.
have um, kind of a Trumpian messianic cult where I've just been watching a lot of the content put out by people who call themselves prophets, and it's interesting because it's very
They explicitly call
decentralized.
themselves prophets.
They call themselves prophets, yeah,
Huh.
and they will, some of them every morning at 6:30 will have a prophecy, or they'll have prophecy in different ways, and they're actually having a revival in Fresno in a couple weeks, which I might go to. Um, but so this is a case where it is super decentralized. In many ways, it's very messianic, very shamanic, but it does not, at least from what I can see, involve a lot of altered states during healing, during prophecy. Prophecies are shared in this very um, somber way or very, matter of fact way. And so I wonder, I haven't done so much research on it, but it's something that I've been investigating now. But I myself am curious about how these groups see themselves in
Hmm.
contrast to Pentecostalism, where they are kind of creating prophetic authority and divine authority in a way that's very different than what you see
Hmm.
in more Pentecostal spaces. I mean, maybe it is the case that there are revivals, that there is a lot of trance and altered states and
Hmm.
speaking in tongues, but from the material that I've seen online, I haven't, which is only to say that I even think in this moment, it's not like very clearly shamanic or not. I think
Hmm.
there are a number of competing approaches that you find in the religious ecosystem.
Hmm. And in terms of just religiosity and also the form of expression of religious change that happens, we talked about earlier, shamanism is often focused on dealing with uncertain events, predicting things ahead of time, or just dealing with the uncertainty around them and the anxiety that comes with that. Um, when something really cataclysmic happens, whether it's a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood, whether it's a like the economy collapses and you have like a 2008 style financial crisis, in those cataclysmic events, those times of crisis, how does that tend to affect religious expression afterwards? Are there any general principles there? Do people tend to become more religious in some form after these cataclysms happen that they can't explain, or does it tend to shift the form of a religious expression one way or another?
Yeah, so two findings come to mind in general. So I think the first is that as conditions of uncertainty go up, people turn to religion more. So there's good research on the early part of the pandemic, where as cases are rising, and in particular jurisdictions where they're rising, you have more religious searching on Google. You have many indicators of people becoming more religious. Then there's also, if we're talking about catastrophes in particular, there's also a good literature showing that catastrophes are very ripe for a very conspiratorial or paranoid version of religion, where you
Mm-hmm.
have witch hunts, witchcraft accusations. You also have non-religious forms of this. I mean, you have pogroms against Jews. Um, and so, yeah, I think catastrophe is is fodder for a very dark form of agentic thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we got into it a little bit earlier, but I was going to ask you about the tie-in between shamanism and witchcraft. Are those two distinct things, or is sort of witchcraft just one possible element of shamanism? And I guess the more general thing I'm really interested in here is how these types of religious expressions, whatever we want to refer to them as, how they're used by people sort of against one another or to make other people do things, to engage in social engineering, in other words.
Yeah. So let's just, I'm just going to define witchcraft
Mm-hmm.
as mystical harm. We'll just define it as mystical harm. And so if we go back to shamans, shamans are entering non-ordinary states, they're providing services, and they're engaging with unseen realities. Now, some of those services can sometimes be attacking outgroup members. I talk about in the book many examples of this. But I think the more common relationship between the shaman and the witch is that the shaman is battling the witch. Now, you know, that someone suffers some kind of misfortune, and either because of what that person suspects or because of the narrative that the shaman helps co-create, it's determined that a particular witch is behind it, that someone caused that harm. Um, and then that witch is dealt with. And so, in this way, when I think about the relationship between the shaman and the witch, I think in some instances they feed off of each other. Now, I think shamans can get their power or can get their relevance from dealing with many kinds of misfortune. You don't need it to be caused by other group mates or outgroup members. It could be caused by taboo violations or local spirits or ghosts or whatever. But I think in many cases, shamans become more powerful when they are seen as attacking witches. And we can see this especially in those instances where shamans rise to the status of messiahs or prophets. So you will often have a case where a society is undergoing some kind of really dramatic upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
It so in the book, I talk about this movement in Uganda where a particular ethnic group felt like it was being attacked by the government. You have a lot of conspiratorial thinking, a lot of paranoid thinking, but then you have a messianic movement where a woman who starts as a shaman becomes a healer, builds an entire movement, goes and tries to attack the Ugandan government. A lot of moments in history where societies encountered colonial authorities or colonial forces, you have messianic movements that often have some kind of witchcraft sentiment in them. Um, so I think they can, in some instances, be mutually reinforcing. There is always, though, a danger that anyone has, that shamans have in battling witchcraft, which is it's seen that if you can battle witchcraft, then you can probably also engage in it. So in Mentawai, the
Mm.
Sikere say they can deal with any kind of illness, but they don't know how to deal in particular with sorcery and witchcraft. Um, and I think that makes sense because in other societies, you often see, yes, this is a way to build power, but it's also a way to create suspicion. And
Mm-hmm.
shamans, once they are seen to know about witchcraft, are also very quickly suspected of
Mm-hmm.
engaging in it and often executed.
Yeah. So shamanism is generally, you would define it as these techniques being used for good, whereas witchcraft is explicitly for the purpose of causing someone harm.
Yeah, and again, some shamans you can go to a shaman to harm other people. There's
Mm-hmm.
a
I
famous
see.
video of
Yeah. Yeah.
Yanomama shamans taking a snuff and attacking babies in a neighboring group.
Hmm.
Um, but
But the
yeah,
common thread here is,
witchcraft
yeah,
would be defined by mystical
yeah.
harm in the definitions we're using.
Special people in the society can be consulted with to engage in their special practices, which have effects
Yes.
on the dynamics of social behavior of the group. And by whatever means they're using, insofar as people go to these people and believe them, it is going to affect their behavior. When we read this stuff and talk about it, especially in the terms traditional societies use, we often say things like magic and spells, and we have all of this language. But one invisible force that is very, very real is language itself. And how does sort of language and the ability to use words in a particular way, how does that tie into shamanism or witchcraft? Is that a common feature where they've got spells or incantations, they're using or deploying language in particular ways that really resonates with people?
I think to some degree. So I guess there are two things over here. One is how often does language feature in particular in these practices? And when I think about it, I think most often shamans are using language. I guess they're using song. They're also
Mm-hmm.
using language to engage with unseen agents. Um, but more generally, a lot of societies see a lot of power in language itself. To say "go and die" is seen not just as like my preference, but to have some kind of import in the world.
Hmm.
This is something I still find very intriguing. Why should we see language not only as communicative, but having some kind of metaphysical power in itself. And so yeah, I think people do see a power to language, but I don't think it's confined to these practices.
And how common and how important is the element of music in traditional shamanism?
It's yeah, so I don't know numbers, but it's incredibly common and very important. So even whether you have psychoactive substances or not, um, you will very often have music. And I think the uses of music can be diverse. So you can have music to help induce altered states, but you can also have music, I think, to create essentially a vibe to. So in Mentawe, or among the Mentawe, when they're calling spirits, they have a very particular kind of song, and it's like a it is like a ghostly song. It shifts between a more chest voice and a vibrato. Um, it's an evocative song. Um, so yeah, music is very common. I think there's a lot to study with the role of music in shamanism and religious contexts and altered states and healing. And I actually don't think we know so much.
What are you working on today in your own research?
Um, I'm working a little on shamanism. My main thing right now, actually, I've been working for a couple years on building a big database of myths, folktales, and legends called Anansi. So it's currently 1,500 myths, folktales, and legends. We've collected them from around the world. And the attempt is there have long been many claims about what mythology looks like, about the hero story, about tricksters, but there's actually very little data behind it. And so it's an attempt to say something empirical about how narrative compares in a way that's rigorous. It's also a way of looking at psychology and norms. Um, yeah, so that's
So,
maybe my big project
so
at
if
the
you're referring
moment.
to like the concept of the hero's journey, the famous book, basically you're talking about a more quantitative approach to start to study how narratives differ or have commonalities across cultures.
Exactly. There have been innumerable claims about how narratives compare. Um, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey being probably the most famous, but then there are, we have we have seven plots, or plots take a particular form, or there are particular archetypal figures that are ubiquitous. There are innumerable claims, but there's actually very, very little empirical work to back it up.
Hmm. Hmm. Is there anything you want to say about the book generally for people? I mean, let's name the book and the date it's coming out, but is there anything, that the book is about that we didn't cover? Anything else you want to get to there as well?
Yeah. So the book is Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. It'll be out on May 20th. And you can also think of the book as a case study for anthropology.
Hmm.
Anthropology is a discipline that's undergoing and has been undergoing for quite a while an ontological crisis. Anthropology departments are splitting across the country. Some have fissioned into new departments. So where I was trained at Harvard, what used to be the anthropology department, now there's two. There's anthropology and there's human evolutionary biology. And
Hmm.
the dispute is often over, is anthropology a science? How useful is evolutionary theory in anthropology?
Hmm.
How relevant is cognitive science in anthropology? Um,
It's the cultural anthropology department versus the biological anthropology department.
That's very often what it is.
Yeah.
In biological anthropology or evolutionary anthropology, so I was trained in a biological anthropology department, and I'm currently in the evolutionary wing at UC Davis, but my work is pretty sociocultural at the same
Yeah.
time. I study topics that are very sociocultural. And so they're often called sociocultural and biological, but I think it's really over, is this a topic? Is this a science or is it a humanities? Um, and so I get a lot of pushback from sociocultural people about my work.
Hmm.
I've done a lot of work on universals in music and had a lot of pushback against, can we study music across cultures? I've had a lot of pushback when people learn that I'm writing a book about shamanism, about whether is shamanism a coherent topic. And so an attempt with this book is not only to make the many arguments that we've talked about and to explore this, but to try to illustrate or demonstrate kind of an integrative anthropology, one that uses science, appreciates evolutionary theory, appreciates cognitive science, but also appreciates the diversity of culture, but isn't
Yes.
afraid to make comparisons, engages with ethnography, is built on deep fieldwork, um, but
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing
also
that
thinks there's value in echoes.
it definitely came through in your writing. So your writing is just very, very nice and pleasant writing. But there was no, in the general realm of anthropology, for anyone who knows about sort of all the different religious wars there have been over the years, on the one hand, you're informed by biology and you're thinking in evolutionary terms and comparative terms, but you're also not discounting, the ethnography or just, the real human, the humanities like part of this, but you're also not, dismissing you're not getting into holy wars about human nature versus nurture and all that stuff. It really has that sort of integrated feel to it.
Yeah, yeah. And I want the book, I mean, because I myself think there's a lot of value in both of these approaches.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's value in thinking about it as a science. I think there's also a lot of value in thinking about the diverse manifestations of human experience and human culture. And I think there's a lot of value in deep ethnographic research and fieldwork. And yeah, and so I think of the book as an expression of an integrated anthropology, one
Mm-hmm.
that appreciates everything that anthropology can do. And, the intersections of anthropology with all of these other intellectual streams.
All right. So Shamanism, the Timeless Religion, it's coming out when?
May 20th.
May 20th, 2025. Um,
Yes.
so for those of you hearing it before then, probably be a link in the episode description. Otherwise, it'll be out there in the world. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with about this subject or anything that we talked about?
One final thing, we didn't say this explicitly, but I do think neo shamans are shamans. I think the people at Burning Man are shamans, and I think the quickness with which we dismiss them as such just reflects this tendency to think that you know so-called traditional forms of culture are more authentic than others.
All right, Professor Manvir Singh, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nick. This was a lot of fun.